Thank you very much, all attendees, for attending this session. I would like to welcome you all for the webinar where we will be discussing the harsh truths in security testing, which is being presented by NetSPI. And of course, our presenter is Sam Kirkman, who is the Director of EMEA Services as well for NetSPI. While we proceed, let me also take you through about SecureLink. SecureLink is an independent risk advisory firm. We have our headquarters in Dubai. However, we are also present in the GCC, across GCC in various countries, including in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, other places as well, including Levant as well. We do have our services available in African continent as well. Starlink is a big group. It has a turnover of almost 2 billion, and it has over 375 employees, and it's present in the region for over the last 16 years or so. SecureLink, as we mentioned before, is an independent advisory firm. We assist our customers in identifying, mitigating, and managing their business as well as security risks. And we provide a complete assessment as well of risks across people, process, and technology, the three main verticals of any organization. We also help put the right governance framework in place to ensure that your risks are continually managed, monitored, and acted upon. We help our customers develop frameworks and implement platforms for automation of your governance, risk, and compliance requirement. Our risk management techniques are drawn from various international standards, and we follow all the best practices that are there. So that is a brief summary about SecureLink. Let's move to our presenter for today, Sam Kirkman. Sam leads the NetSPI's EMEA penetration testing team. As a penetration tester and cybersecurity consultant, Sam focuses on translating the complex technical issues into risks that business can easily understand, with his core areas of expertise covering web applications, infrastructure, and cloud security. When he's not testing existing security controls, Sam helps to shape the strategy for their implementation as a security architect as well. This knowledge is used to help a broad range of organizations improve their cybersecurity postures, ranging from small family businesses to multinational corporations, banks, and national governments as well. You will get to know more details about the same as well during this presentation. So without taking too much of time of Sam, allow me to invite Sam to take over the session from here. Go ahead, Sam.
Thank you very much, Manish. Good afternoon to everyone. It's good to be talking to you today. I'll start my introduction here from where Manish has left off. I am our Director of EMEA Services here at NetSPI, and as Manish mentioned, I'm a penetration tester. So rather than just looking after strategic high-level things, I am somebody who works with my systems and tools to actually hack organizations and help them understand the risks that they're looking at. Before I go into more about NetSPI, though, I think I'd like to start with a little note on the relationship that we have with SecureLink, so that you know what it's like. SecureLink, as mentioned, is very sensitive to this part of the world, and that's one of the reasons our relationship works so well. Globally, from the USA to UK, well, we work closely with SecureLink, connect us with the right organizations, the ones that we can help the most. And part of that comes from the fact that SecureLink cover a much broader range of services than NetSPI does. We are pure pen testing. We are security testing focused. And that's where working with an organization like SecureLink is really good. We can connect ourselves at the right point where an organization needs security testing, and then SecureLink's there to help you with all other aspects of your security too. So it's now worth me explaining who are NetSPI? What are we all about? Well, this is a little selection of numbers that illustrate that. In terms of size, we report over millions of vulnerabilities every year, well over 4 million that we're up to at this point, thousands of engagements. And I think those top numbers really put it in perspective. 2 out of the big 3 global cloud providers, I can't say which ones, but it wouldn't take you long to guess which of those 2 we're working with, most of the US banks out there, many of the biggest healthcare providers, and those FANG tech companies that you'll have heard of too. At this point, with NetSPI's experience, 20 years or so in the industry and a strong team, if it's a big, important business and they care about security, there's a very good chance we're already working with them. With that in mind, it's worth looking at what we actually do day to day. And here's a nice selection of what our services look like. There are the traditional ones, things like application pen testing that covers websites, web applications, but it also covers mobile apps and even those thick applications, the kind that you run on a computer system and they connect to something else. We'll cover just about everything in that space. But we also have some more unusual areas as well. Our cloud pen testing area is an interesting one. You'll have seen most likely other security testing companies that work with cloud security, but very few of them will work like we do. To put that in context, when we approach cloud testing, we approach it not just from a compliance and checking against standards kind of view, we'll approach it as hackers. In fact, so much so that we've written an entire book on how to hack Azure. That book's one that's available for anyone to buy and pick up, and it helps you to understand the difference between just running through a checklist of, am I ticking the boxes for this particular control that's recommended, and am I actually safe from hackers trying to break into my cloud environment? We help a lot of customers around the world with that across AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud as well. And we often look at Kubernetes and given they're quite a common and somewhat complex part of modern cloud infrastructure. There are a couple of others in here that I'll pick out as well. Blockchain pen testing is an interesting one. There are very few organizations that have the skill set to do that. But just later today, we've got a meeting with our team here in EMEA to talk about the progress that we've made in the space and some of the work that we're doing with organizations that you might not have even heard of yet, but we're expecting to be everything from massive financial corporations and banks to startups that are new to the blockchain space. For those that are interested in a bit more automation and a little less of the manual side of things, that's where the breach and attack simulation and attack surface management side of things may be of interest. If you've ever had a little bit of frustration at not knowing what your organization has on the internet, attack surface management is there to help your frustration. What we do with that service is use a bunch of different automated mechanisms, many of which we have built using our own development team and our own time, to find everything that your organization has on the internet. We'll start with what you can tell us, domains that you own, IP addresses, that kind of thing. And we'll go and find anything else that may be related. And once we've found it, we'll then scan it and find whether or not it's presenting risk. It can happen 24/7, 365 days a year. So you keep as time goes on, and you can respond to threats as soon as they appear rather than waiting for to pop up. Breach and attack simulation works a little differently. If you've ever experienced a red team or some kind of attack simulation in the past, you can think of breach and attack simulation from NetSPI as an automated way of doing something very similar. Instead of a long process of individual people trying to break into your organization, breach and attack simulation is heavily automated. It enables you to run very short playbooks or exercises that will chain together real-world attack scenarios and allow you to execute them yourself so that you don't have to get individual testers to do that every time. What we see most of our customers use this for is working out, do the controls that they have implemented actually mitigate the threats they're worried about? Because you can run it yourself automatically, you can, again, keep an eye on this instead of waiting for an annual test. But this isn't a presentation all about sales, so I'll leave this here. If you're interested in these services, we can absolutely provide you with these slides, and we can also arrange some conversations. But for now, I'll get to the reason that you're here. So let's have a look at today's agenda. Today is all about talking about the things that don't often get discussed. There are lots of things in the security space that are very important to understand, but they can be a little bit sensitive to talk about. Today, I'd like to do exactly that. So by the end of this call, by the end of this webinar, we should be able to collectively agree on how we can do things better in the future. From this information, you'll be able to make better decisions about how you spend your money, your time, and your resources to get the security outcomes that you're looking for. And if we can do that, you should find that you feel less stressed and more comfortable about the environments that you care for. So let's start with penetration testing. Many of you will have heard of it before, but for those that are relatively new to the world of pen testing, think of this as hacking, but ethically. This is people who have the skills attempting to break into your organization or break the security that you've applied to your applications and systems to help you understand if it's possible and how you can prevent it happening if there's somebody that's really trying to attack you. So we're often called ethical hackers as well as penetration testers. There are various companies around the world that offer services like penetration testing or penetration testing itself, but the way in which they do it does vary. One of the conversations that we have is, why should I get NetSPI instead of a different company? The simple answer to that is, it depends what you're after. If your objective is to get a report, if what you want is a document that just lists a bunch of things that are wrong, and that's all you need, NetSPI is not the company for you. The reality is NetSPI is about quality, and that's what we focus on. So if you're the kind of organization that is actually interested in security, interested in protecting yourselves against a hack that could destroy your ability to operate, whether it be ransomware or something else entirely, if you care about that risk and finding ways to reduce it, that's where we come in. So one pen test isn't quite the same as another, and the simple reason for it is that one company will test in a very different way to another. Companies that I've seen in the past, and some of them I have even worked with, will sometimes take a very simple approach. Their operational aim is to give you that report for the cheapest price they can. To do that, those organizations will use automated scanners and not a lot more. A few automated scans combined with some basic testing with some simple tools that you could find if you were to look online is usually where they focus, and they'll deliver you a report and it will not cost very much, but it won't give you an insight into the real risks you're facing or much guidance around how you can fix them. That's where an organization like NetSPI comes in. Our focus is not just on the report. In fact, our report is just a small part of what we do. The reason that we try to be different is that we focus specifically on the outcomes you're interested in. When you speak to us, it's quite likely that you're not actually wanting a pen test. You're wanting to understand, how safe are my systems? That's the question we aim to answer. And that's why when we deliver work, our testers run to a very tailored checklist, a minimum baseline of all the things that they need to check, which combines both the automated stuff that everybody uses, but a lot of manual guidance in there as well. Instead of it being dependent on the individual skills of a person, our checklist has all the guidance in so that even our most junior consultants can deliver work at the standard that you would expect from the best. As a result, we're able to work with our customers and give them platforms like our Resolve platform, where we won't go into the details on that today, but instead of just a PDF report, you get a whole platform, a web application that lets you manage all of this data and make meaningful conclusions from it. So one pen test is not always the same as another, and that's well worth keeping in mind when you're deciding, do I need a pen test? And if I do, who should I ask to help me with that? If you want quality or if you want pricing, it's a very different kind of outcome. So let's look at what actually drives the need for pen testing. The big one, the one that we most often hear about, is compliance, strangely enough. In many cases, organizations will approach security testing businesses like NetSPI and say, hey, I need a penetration test. A team like us will say, well, why? What kind of information do you want to learn about your organization and its security? And sometimes the answer is just, oh, I don't need that. I just need to have a pen test. That's driven by compliance. Compliance with various standards that are required around the world, whether it's because you work in financial services or you're a government entity, or you're simply being asked to comply with a certain standard by one of your customers or a fellow business that you're working with. Compliance is often something that requires penetration testing. And in some cases, that's the only reason that security is done at an organization, to meet requirements. The reality, though, is that compliance and security are not the same. In fact, there's very little overlap. If you were to look at a globally recognized standard in the security space, something like ISO 27001 for information security, That is a compliance baseline. You could be entirely compliant with every element of ISO 27001, but not actually secure. We see this quite often in organizations that have focused purely on compliance, and then they've achieved compliance and said, we must be safe now. But the reality is, as we'll come on to see, that attackers will always find ways of attacking an organization and finding a way in. And ISO 27001 alone or similar standards will not be enough to succeed in the security space. Another way of thinking about this is on this slide here. I'm speaking as somebody who lives in the UK here, and our laws around riding a motorbike or a motorcycle require you to wear a helmet and nothing else. So here in the UK, to be compliant with the law, you can ride at any speed you want that's underneath the speed limits, wearing only a helmet and maybe shorts and a t-shirt. Now, the reality is that's not safe. And I think anybody who's even seen a motorcycle will know that that's not safe. If you have an accident, the amount of injury that you're going to sustain if you're only wearing a helmet is going to be substantial, broken bones, all sorts of injuries. So security means wearing more than that in this case. It means wearing leathers, boots, everything else you need so that if something goes wrong, you've got more than one line of defense protecting you. This is the big difference between the world of compliance and security. So if there's anyone listening that's focusing on complying with standards more than you are looking at real world security and risk, it might be time to think a little differently. And if you're interested in that conversation, we're certainly happy to help you. For now, though, let's take a look at tooling. Expensive security tooling specifically. So on the left-hand side of this colorful diagram, these shield icons represent the tools that you've paid for. I won't name any in particular, but you could say that the top one is a SIEM solution of some kind, and you could say that this bottom one is some kind of endpoint detection and response system. They play quite nicely together. One of them will look after your laptops, maybe your mobile phones, anything you issue to your team, and the other will give you a nice single pane of glass view so you can see everything going on, in theory. The reality is that that isn't what happens in the real world. So this blue circle represents everything that's happening in your organization, every single event, security related or not, that's going on. Something that you can't really measure. In reality, when you've connected up some tools, they're not going to see every single event. They're going to see some of these events. That's what this green circle represents. Most security tools these days will be able to integrate with quite a lot of your technology, but there will be some things that are missing. In the most common scenarios we see, this is network infrastructure, things like switches and routers, which haven't been connected to security tooling for whatever reason. Once you've got limited visibility because your tooling can't see everything, that will only then alert you on some of those things that it can see. That's what this yellow circle here represents. That's a good thing in the sense that you don't want your tools to be raising alerts on everything that's going on in your organization. You just want the alerts for the things that actually matter. The problem is that those alerts don't always align with the actual dangers inside your organization. This is something we see time and time again. In many cases, we'll conduct a red team operation, which is where we very realistically simulate an attack on an organization to help them understand what would that look like. In many cases, our target organization, our customers, will be able to see lots of alerts and they'll process them, trying to work out, is this a real security threat? Are we being attacked? You may be able to relate to this if you speak to one of your SOC analysts, for those that have a security operations center, or anyone in the security team. You might even be one of those people yourself. There's plenty of alerts that are false positives. The problem with that is that it distracts you from the ones that matter. That's where the overlap is between the yellow circle and red. Those are the alerts you definitely want to care about. Sometimes it's difficult to find them, though, when there are so many unimportant alerts. It gets worse, though, when some of the security issues don't even involve alerts. There are plenty of times we manage to execute an attack that just isn't alerted. It's logged. Something records what we did somewhere, and it may be shown in one of those event management systems if you have a SIEM, but it doesn't raise an alert simply because the system didn't detect it as an attack. In that case, it's not great, but at least you can still see what's happening. Unfortunately, though, there are also times where that red circle overlaps with the blue circle on the right-hand side. In that scenario, this isn't even covered by security tools that you've integrated. There are security threats that you don't even have records for. This also happens quite a lot in practice. And because of this, organizations that try to solve the cybersecurity problem by simply buying tools and installing them in the environment will always have weaknesses that remain unfixed. And this is where security testing comes in. So let's have a look at the reality of red teaming next. To give you a little bit of an example of how penetration testing works together with tooling to give you the kind of outcomes you're after. So let's take a standard scenario. An attacker is looking at your website, maybe your main website, the one that represents your business, and they find some vulnerability. Hopefully not possible, but perhaps there's a 0-day that hasn't yet to be fixed by the vendor behind the server that you use, something like that. If they find a way into your web server, in theory, maybe they'll go find an internal server, grab some credentials, usernames and passwords, find their way onto a domain controller after a lot of hard work, and then make themselves an IT administrator. Because administrators have broad access, they can access your stuff. In this case, this is your critical business data. Could be customer data, could be trade secrets that enable you to stay ahead of your competitors. Whatever it is, that's the expected route that attackers will take. I say expected because this is what most of the technical security controls we look at are designed to prevent. A lot of the tools you buy, whether it's endpoint protection systems, network protection, or perhaps other things entirely, are designed to prevent lateral movement, is the term we use, for moving from an internal server to a domain controller, or from a web server to something else. Or indeed, guessing credentials, guessing passwords. All of these tools focus on that as the attack path. And they do a pretty good job of preventing it if you follow that attack path. So attackers don't. They just don't follow that attack path. They'll aim for something else. And today, in the real world, what we're seeing is attackers will target people more than anything. Or specifically, they'll target accounts. What that means in practice is that if you've got an organization full of hundreds, perhaps thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of users, how many accounts do you suspect are using a very strong password? Hopefully, you think it's all of them. But I would hazard a guess that you suspect that someone somewhere is using a weak password. Perhaps, too, you have accounts that have been set up for test purposes, or even for users and people that are yet to join your organization. And they have a default password until people actually start, or those accounts are reused at the future. If they're active accounts, even if they're not associated with somebody, and even if they don't have excessive access, a single account can be a foothold, entry point, an access point into your organization. And this is what attackers are going for. Traditionally, this could be a phishing attack, but we have also seen cases of bribery and direct attempts to pay people that work in your organizations to give away their passwords, even their security keys. That's happened with some high-profile breaches in recent weeks. We've also seen third-party compromise scenarios. So if you work with third-party vendors that have access to your computer systems, you might well see a scenario where their user accounts inside your organization are compromised. Even though your security may be strong, how do you think the security of every single supplier that you work with is doing? Once they've got access to a user account, they could start using complex exploits and traditional hacking techniques to target different computer systems, or they could just look for some files that haven't been protected. Many of you may still be using on-premises file shares, things like SMB, folders that people click through on their laptops. In many cases, we see organizations haven't secured those folders, so a single user may well be able to access fairly sensitive information from the IT teams or the finance teams or any other team. And it is very common that with enough patience and the right tools, we can quickly find usernames, passwords, and other sensitive information that we can use to go from that one account to somebody else's account, or even take over a whole computer system or group of systems just by finding information. So pause for a moment and think about how you would detect that. those file shares are designed to be accessed by your staff. And as far as the systems are concerned, this is a normal user account accessing files as part of their normal business day. The only thing that you might be able to detect is if that account's accessing files it doesn't usually access. There are tools out there to do that, but they require both a significant investment of time and money to set them up and a significant amount of tuning to be able to only raise alerts for strange behavior rather than just normal day-to-day usage of file shares. It's a very difficult thing to detect, and it's also a very successful way for us to access the accounts of people like IT administrators. That's ultimately getting us to the same outcome. So today, the traditional view of protect your computer systems and make sure you're using decent passwords alone isn't enough. If attackers can find any way to compromise just a single user in your organization, there are now well-established techniques that can enable us to find our way to your stuff, your important business information, without having to face the seriously powerful security controls that you could have implemented at this stage or brought in through security tooling. We're finding ways around it, and that's where it's worth looking at the difference between investing in security and the outcomes you're actually looking for. This graph is meant to be a simple illustration of this. At the bottom, you've got your investment. The more money you invest, the further right we move. And up the side, we've got difficulty for attackers. That is how hard it's going to be for whether it's a pen tester or a criminal to break into your organization, steal your stuff, execute ransomware, do some damage. So the idea traditionally is that as you spend more money, you will be able to make it more and more difficult for attackers to do damage. But it's not a linear relationship. It's not a simple case of, if I spend 100,000 US dollars, I'll have the best security. Unfortunately, it's not even close. In fact, you can actually see spikes where organizations implement specific, very valuable controls that make a big difference. In this case, strong passwords we just talked about do make it more difficult to compromise accounts, but they don't make it impossible. Multi-factor authentication, that MFA, is a similar control, very effective, but not perfect. Making sure your endpoint detection and response, your EDR solutions, are standardized, so you've got one system for detecting malware and malicious activity across all your devices. And then this last one's a bit technical. You may not have heard of LLMNR or NBTNS, and don't worry if those are unfamiliar terms. These are old protocols that are standard on Windows devices from Microsoft. If you don't disable those protocols, we as attackers can use them to capture credentials. If there is any device nearby to us when we've managed to get inside a network that is able to use those old protocols, it generally just takes us a few minutes to be able to capture a password hash, like a special stored version of a password. But we can then use that to access other systems. So those two old protocols remain a very powerful way of going from one person or one system being compromised to having a whole host of your network under the control of attackers. So disabling that, along with the other controls, really increases the difficulty that we face with attackers. There are plenty of other controls I could include here, but this is just a sample. What you'll notice, though, is that then investment continues and the benefits start to be a little less obvious. Most companies will start then to push harder and harder down a compliance-driven route. They'll do some basic security, and then they'll spend an awful lot of time and money strategizing about what we should do next and worrying about loads of policies and documentation, which is good, but it doesn't directly increase security. Just because you have a policy on managing your infrastructure doesn't mean you're actually managing it in the way the policy describes. What we do see is that eventually the best organizations will reach this second peak. They'll start implementing the really top tier security controls. They'll start using hardware authentication keys. You might have heard of the brand name YubiKey. There are a few others out there. They're a very good way of making sure that your multi-factor authentication, or even just authentication as a whole, is far more secure. At the moment, that technology with hardware authentication keys is very, very difficult to phish. In practical terms, it's almost impossible to phish. It makes it so difficult that we very rarely see even attempts to phish staff who are using hardware authentication keys. On top of that, you've got the more difficult things as well, patching your entire estate. Most companies try to do that at an early stage of their investment in cybersecurity, but getting it right is both powerful and difficult. The same is true with incident response, or IR, as I've got here. It's difficult to have an incident response plan that is very effective. But if we can do it, it has a massive impact on security. Because if you have an effective incident response plan, you'll be able to detect and stop an attack before it does significant damage. The further an attack progresses, particularly in the case of ransomware and similar threats, the harder it is to stop it. So with this in mind, it's also worth looking at what happens if you implement security controls and invest in security, but don't quite do it in the right way. This is probably a more accurate representation of what we see in reality. Most organizations will invest in security, but they won't necessarily have the resources to make good use of that investment. So you'll see there's some dips here. There'll be plenty of organizations that look at investing in privileged access management as an example, or password storage, often that goes together, something that enables all high security passwords for administrators to be stored in one place. You can think of just about any high-level security control that centralizes things in this sense. If you implement those poorly, what you can end up with is bringing together sensitive information and not securing it sufficiently. So we do unfortunately see scenarios where companies have invested in some kind of privileged access management solution that allows administrators to go and log into the system to get a temporary password that gives them access to something else. In theory, it means that they don't have insecure static passwords to access sensitive information. It's a very good way of protecting things. The problem is that if you implement that system and you don't secure that system, we as attackers or pen testers are able to then break into the system that controls everything. And all of a sudden, what you've actually done is make it much easier for us to access a key system and use it and all the data on it to access everything else. This tends to happen when companies move too fast and without the right support for their security program. This is one of the harsh truths of security. It is not a linear relationship between money and time and the outcomes that you're after. This is something that at NetSPI we focus on quite a lot. While we do have our salespeople and our testers and all of the teams that you would expect in any organization like ours, we specifically have solutions architects. And their role is to connect what you're interested in with the services that we offer, to try and avoid the dips in it, so that when you work with NetSPI, you can be confident that you'll get security testing in the right direction. And we'll use these dips before they get too deep. If we can see a sign of something looking like it might be a risk, and you can fix it before somebody else finds it. That leads me on to the final part of what I'd like to talk about here. We've run through a few different facts that have been familiar, hopefully some of which were less familiar. But let's look at how we can use this kind of knowledge to do things differently in the future and do things better. What I'm showing on screen here are two images generated by AI, simply because it would be an interesting experiment. AI, particularly recent progress in AI with things like ChatGPT and equivalents, is an interesting change in how we work, in how everyone can work. If you think of talking to AI, some of you may well have used it. How do you ask it for something? Traditionally speaking, if you came to a company like NetSPI, you might say, hey, I'd like a penetration test. Here's the things I'd like you to test. And here's the kind of report that we need at the end. But these days, speaking to an AI, you might say something like, how secure is this code that you might give it? What you're ultimately asking for is an outcome or an output, an outcome rather than an output. If you can say to, whether it's AI or a company like us, instead of saying, I want a pen test, you can say, I want to know how secure is this system or my entire organization. At that point, we can use solution architects and the other people that we have at NetSPI to help you find the right path to get there. Instead of telling us the output that you need because you've decided how to get there, let us help you find the right path. It means less work for you and a high probability of success as well. When you work with us and you tell us what you're really interested in, instead of just telling us a list of things that you need us to do, we can start finding an optimal path, one that saves you time and money, and most importantly, definitely achieves the outcomes that you're looking for. One of the worst things for me as a pen tester is seeing that I've done a test, I've written a report, I've delivered it to the customer, and the customer hasn't read it. That's surprisingly common, even today. But it happens because that customer has either only been interested in compliance and they just needed a report, or it's because the report wasn't actually helpful for them because they weren't interested in reading a report. What they were interested in was actually understanding the risk. And if that's the case, we can much more easily do that by combining a report with a debrief call or another conversation where we'll talk to you about how you can remediate the issues and provide you with everything that you need. So when you're talking about security testing and security as a whole, focus on the outcomes. What is it you want to achieve? Even if it's something high level, like I want to be able to go home and sleep at night, knowing that if there's a problem, I'll know about it. Whatever your outcomes are, start there and work with the experts around you to find the right journey, find the right path. The last point I'll make here is on scoping. Scoping is the concept of targeting the work that you do towards, in theory, the objective that you're aiming for. So in the world of penetration testing, scoping is what defines what we hack and what we test and what we report on. There are a lot of different ways of doing scoping, but one of the things that becomes quite common for organizations that are either new to the world of pen testing or have other reasons for doing so is that the scope of the work that we're able to execute doesn't cover the entire target that we're looking at. As an example, let's take a website. Sometimes customers will come to us and they'll say, oh, we'd only like you to test this page of our website. And we'll have a conversation. We'll say, we can do that. If that's absolutely what you need, we can do it. But why? Why is it that you want just that page testing? And sometimes there'll be a very sensible answer that says, well, we had a test just the other week, so we only need this bit changing testing because we just changed it. Often, though, it's a different conversation. Often scoping is done incorrectly because people didn't necessarily understand how attacks take place. Sometimes people say, oh, well, this is the only page that's dangerous on our website. And that's very rarely true. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, I don't want your report to include loads of issues because then people in my organization might get angry with us for security. But we're here to help. And so we can talk to the people that might be angry at the stuff that we find and help them to understand how we can fix it. Working instead of giving you a list of problems and you on your way. Scoping becomes a very important part of getting the outcomes that you're after. If you're interested in security, if you really want to be able to be confident in both your own organization, the security of the systems that you're responsible for, and the future success of your organization as a whole, getting the scope right for any work that you do, whether it be pen testing or other consulting or other work entirely, is key. So in this case, this scope is clearly not covering most of the target. It's clearly not going to provide you with meaningful insight into what matters. It's going to miss stuff, and the stuff that it misses might be the stuff that attackers find instead. So focus on your scoping and make sure that when you have the conversation, talk to the people that you're working with. Talk to your pen testing team, your solutions architect, whoever it is that you're working with. Make sure that they're happy too, that they can give you the outcome that you're looking for. You'll always get a report, but whether or not you get the results you're interested in and the outcomes you're after, that is a different matter entirely. So I'm going to pause about here now and have a little bit of a QA point up. You are very, very welcome to drop some QA questions in here. If you have any questions at all, please do fire away. Otherwise, I do have a couple of stories that we could discuss in terms of real world scenarios. And if you're interested in a couple of stories from the field, from the front line, then do let us know in the chat as well, and I'll jump onto those in a few moments.
Thank you very much, Sam, for those details. It is very, very valuable to have inputs from you. Let's look at some of the questions that we have. One of the questions that we have, Sam, is how can NetSPI support social engineering?
Thanks, Manish. Yeah, that's a good question. Social engineering comes in a few different forms. So the traditional one is a phishing exercise via email, something that will craft emails that are tailored to your business, not just the standard templates that you would expect from companies that automate the process. We'll build something tailored to you specifically with an understanding of the business, the industry you operate in, perhaps even depending on what you would like us to do, we can tailor it to individual people as well. We could impersonate a member of staff. We could base it on a recent policy announcement. We can go as far as we need to go to give you an accurate simulation of a very advanced phishing exercise and a social engineering attempt in that sense. We can do the same for vishing, as it's often known, so voice-based phishing, usually executed via phone calls. The same idea, we can add whatever pretext you would be interested in to make sure that it's a very, very effective simulation. We've had some great success with that in the past, where some of our team have made phone calls pretending to be staff to the IT support teams of organizations, asking about how things are done, what they can do to fix problems, getting an insight into real world fixes. What they can then do is swap around and pretend to be the IT team, speak to various people in the organization. And because they've previously spoken to the IT people, they know what to say, and they know how to say it in exactly the same way that the real IT team does. As a result, in the past, we've been able to successfully socially engineer organizations that have otherwise escaped successfully from these kind of exercises without being successfully caught in some kind of social engineering attack. The last point I'd say is on the physical side. We've got a dedicated team for physical social engineering. This team is trained and equipped to find weaknesses in things like building security, so that we'll find doors that are locked insecurely or not locked at all. We'll find architectural flaws. One of the more interesting ones was a toilet system where the room with all of the toilets had a small panel in the wall that was designed to access wiring, piping, just for maintenance. Turns out that you could climb through that hole in the wall if you took the panel off and walk straight past all of the security barriers and into a data center environment in that same building. So we'll find things like that, help you identify them, and help you determine whether or not you need bigger locks, better locks, security cameras, motion detection, or just to fill the hole with cement, whatever case may be. I think that covers about everything in summary, but happy to go into that in more detail or take another question, Manish.
Sam, that's a very interesting example that you mentioned. Because we were doing one of the audits, in fact, the security checks in the data center, and it turned out that one of the emergency exits was being used as a smoking zone, and it was so easy for anybody to just go around the building and just walk in and come in as one of the employees, pretending to somebody who's just gone out for a smoke. So yes, physical security access is also equally important. The next question that we have, Sam, is from one of the attendees who's asking if can Sam give a little more detail on how the collaborator user was compromised in the cloud scenario. This is very interesting because the security of this cloud services that is being used. This is a question that we are getting more and more frequently about how do you assure yourself about the security of the cloud services. Though most of them are outsourced, they also want to reassure themselves about the security of the data that they are entrusting this cloud service provider. So if you could elaborate more on this incident.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, the cloud space does present a whole new way of thinking about security controls, something that we are very keen on, and we do a lot of research in this space. So collaborator will be is likely a reference to contributor in Azure. So Microsoft defined a few different roles for levels of access, going from global administrator down to just read-only access. If you're a contributor, sometimes known as collaborator, you'll have limited access to a resource. One of the examples that we've seen is an automation account. So with Azure, you can set up an automation process that can just execute some business process without the need for human intervention. It could be, a common example might be deploying a user account and setting up that account with the right access to the right information and deploying a machine, a virtual machine, using that account. That kind of scenario is traditionally done by an IT team manually, but using an automation account, you can do it automatically. The risk around it is that automation accounts will need some kind of privileged access to resources. They'll need to be able to set things up, deploy infrastructure, create user accounts, perform sensitive operations. So those automation accounts will need credentials, powerful ones too. So what we often see is that those accounts will be set up with sensitive information, credentials embedded. But it turns out that in Azure, if you've got contributor access or collaborator access, you'll be able to pull those credentials out. And what that means is that if you've got what looks like limited access, or you've given somebody in your team limited access, you might think, I've set this up in a sensible way. They've got limited access to the cloud environment. They can't do things that an administrator could do. Everything looks okay. But if they have the contributor role, they can tweak the automation account's code so that instead of just doing what it usually does, it also lists all of its credentials and just gives them out in a little text file or any other mechanism that you want to get the credentials out. From there, you can go from a collaborator or a contributor, as it's known, to an administrator. Potentially, you can be whatever those credentials are. It's a pretty serious attack vector, and it's quite a common one that we see. If anyone's interested in how you can fix those particular kind of flaws, I can definitely go into that in more detail. But what I could do, depending on the audience, is take a look at a real story from the OT space for a couple of minutes before we wrap up. Or if we've got a list of questions, we can carry on through those. What do you think, Manish?
Yes, yes, definitely, fine. We can do that. However, we do have some more questions, so maybe we can, if we answer those questions, we can move into this direction as well. Because I see a lot of questions coming regarding the cloud services. For example, the next question is, most of our workload and services are moving to the cloud. What permission is, or rather, what permissions are required from cloud providers like Microsoft, Google, Oracle, etc., for conducting these activities that we are discussing?
Sure, testing activities, I'll take that as in this case. So the simple answer is read-only permission is generally all that we need to be able to execute some pretty detailed analysis of the security setup that you have. So if that's something you're comfortable with, it's read-only access. However, we do execute quite a lot of cloud penetration tests using contributor access or the equivalent. So limited access, equivalent to a normal user that isn't an IT administrator, somebody who's allowed to access the cloud environment, but isn't necessarily a very privileged person. The reason that we do that is that we often see scenarios where somebody who's been given limited access, a bit like how I described, can find ways to give themselves very unlimited access if they know where to look. So it depends, as I mentioned earlier, on the needs of the organization that we're working with. If you come to us and you say, I'd like a cloud pen test, then we'll give you a cloud pen test. But if you come to us and you say, I'd like to understand if a normal user in our cloud environment can make themselves an administrator and do some damage, then we can start looking at how to give you that outcome that you're interested in and give you the answer to the question. Or if you come to us and you say, I'd like to know if somebody who can only read and can't touch anything in our Azure environment or our AWS or Google Cloud environment can find a way to go from only being able to read stuff to being able to change stuff. If you'd let us know what you're afraid of happening, we'll help you understand how risky and how likely it is to happen in reality.
Okay. Yeah. So we do have another question where, well, this is a little different topic, which is, can NetSPI do a compromise assessment?
Sure, we can definitely. I think that might be a reference to kind of an assumed breach or assumed compromise.
Yes, I
So
would believe it would be of assumed compromise
yes,
in this.
so just to make sure I'm covering all bases, we don't do instant response. So if you've got an active incident or you believe you've been compromised, we'd recommend a different team, and SecureLink folks will be able to direct in that sense. But if you're interested in what kind of top compromised, what would come next, we can definitely help you understand.
Another question that we have is, this is also another interesting angle to this. How can the clients give us trust since we are third party, which is outside their organization, who's doing a penetration testing?
Sure. And I'm wondering if that is in relation to we'd be testing you as the third party to another customer, or if you as our customer would like us to test a different company because they're a third party to you. I suppose I can answer both.
Yes, I
The main thing is
consider
if
both
you,
scenarios here. Yes.
sure. Yeah, so if you approach us and you're interested in security testing of your systems, the main thing that we do there is carry on the testing, but we can provide attestation letters that will confirm both what we've seen, what's been fixed, and represent a formal document signed by NetSPI that says, here's what we did, here's what we saw, and here's what you guys have fixed. You can then pass that to your to the third party that's requesting that you undergo some security testing as evidence of both the testing piece and the results of that testing to prove that you've successfully gone through. And you're an organization that comes to us, but you'd like us to test another organization, that's a little challenging, but usually possible. What we'll do is involve the other organization in the conversation and we'll say, hey, we'd like to do some testing. It's going to be paid for by you guys as the organization. We need permission to execute the test. In most cases, organizations are quite happy with that. If they're not having to pay and they just need to allow the testing to happen and they're able to see at least some of the results, most of the time we're able to help with that as well. It's something we're doing increasingly because of third-party risk being really quite a significant one for organizations around the world. Some companies are doing a great job of tightening security, given the scale of cyber attacks happening around the world. Others are not doing a very good job. And if one of the third parties you work with happens to be in that category, there is a definite risk that you could be breached, not because of your own weaknesses, but because of weaknesses in other companies that you have relationships with. So we can help you in both cases there.
Got it, Sam. So there's another case that maybe you can give your inputs as well regarding the kind of services that we provide. This question is about PCI DSS compliance. One of the attendees are required to be PCI DSS compliant, which is SAQ CD by IATA for their travel business divisions. This requires them to have ASV to do the penetration testing and vulnerability scan every year. So they're asking, are NetSPI also in a position to conduct PCI DSS ASV so that we can work together?
That's a very good question. We do conduct PCI DSS testing. I'll have to cross-check with one of my colleagues whether or not we do the ASV component specifically. We are up for renewal with approved scanning vendor status, so I'll just check that we hold it. And I can include that in a follow-up email. Otherwise, we usually conduct PCI DSS testing for internal networks to work out if your segregation is sufficient, as that's a core requirement of PCI DSS to separate the cardholder data environment from everywhere else. So we can definitely help you with that, and that's one of the more advanced components of PCI testing. So we can certainly work with you in that respect, and I'll just get some confirmation on the external ASV side for you, and I'll include that after the call.
Yes, please do that. We do have one more question. This is regarding the standardization. This is regarding, is there any standardization must pass through for doing penetration testing, pen testing?
That's a good question. There's a few standards around the world of pen testing. So for us as testers, there are a few different organizations around the world that provide exams to measure our testers' quality. So you may have heard of Offensive Security, who provide the OSCP, Offensive Security Certified Professional, and a range of other qualifications. They're quite a good mechanism for determining if we are training our staff to the right level. We also then have Crest, who are a global entity, and they provide exams that are based out here in the UK. And they'll assess various testers on infrastructure, web applications, and beyond to work out if they're able to deliver penetration testing at the right level. There's also the Cyber Scheme in the UK and a few others around the world that provide similar services. The aim there is to make sure that you've got a standard level of testing quality. From your side as customers and people who would be requesting the penetration testing to take place, things are a little bit broader. Depending on where you are in the world, in terms of individual countries and the governments that you either are within or report to, the requirements will differ. So for some areas, say in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, we have certain requirements from the financial services sector that will only apply to certain areas of the country and certain industries within the country. In other areas, there'll be totally separate requirements or no requirements at all. In that case, it's best to consult with folks like SecureLink to get some advice around where you need to go. And we can also help you with that as well from a very specific pen testing point of view to make sure you're complying with whatever standards you need to. And the tests that we deliver will again give you the outcomes that you need based on those requirements. I think that answers that question, but do let me know if not.
Absolutely, it does, Sam. In fact, the next question is slightly relative there, which is there a size of projects that NetSPI can accept? And I believe this would be more probably looking at the lower end. And I think this is where what you are discussing now is partnering with partners like us, like SecureLink, can help us reduce the efforts, which would probably at times would also be able to help us support a smaller size of projects as well. As we had mentioned right at the initial stages, that NetSPI has conducted the exercises right from some small family-run businesses as well. However, I would leave you to answer this as well.
Yes, well, you're absolutely right, Manish. We can handle projects of just about any scale at this stage. When we're working with organizations like SecureLink, you really do get a smooth experience. You can let them know that you need a security test, what that scope roughly needs to be, and then they'll work with us to get that planned out, a timeline, a draft of the scope, all the costings, and then we'll come back to you with a clear proposal on what we suggest as a plan to do next, and that will aim to deliver the outcomes that you've described. The alternative, of course, is for speaking to other organizations, and if you were to not go through SecureLink, you would have to do every single step of that process manually. So the benefit is we can definitely do small scale tests. If you just like to try NetSPI to see if we're up to the standard that you would like, see how we compare to other security testers you use, or if you're new to the world of pen testing and you've never done this before, you can schedule a very small test just to see the kind of quality that we deliver, and hopefully you'll be impressed by it. If you're on the other end of the spectrum and you know that you've got an awful lot of testing that needs to happen, we can work with you through the SecureLink team to make sure that you have everything in place, not just the testing, but all of the program management and the project management in place, so that again, whether it's a small or a big project, it's a smooth experience and you get the results you need.
I think let's have time for one more question. This is related to cloud services. We are squeezing this in, especially because this may be a question faced by many of our customers as well, that there are different types of the cloud services available with public cloud, private cloud, and hybrid as well. So how can attackers attack our organization where they are sharing services in public cloud with other organizations?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. So I'll try to keep the answer brief. I know we're on the end of our time now. So the public cloud, in many cases, does a very good job of separating your data from another customer's data. There are, however, some scenarios where we've seen breaches of that boundary. Usually those breaches are fixed fairly quickly. They're vulnerabilities that are very specific, and when researchers find them, whether it's Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, or a similar cloud organization, they'll fix those issues fast. The problem is, if you are very unlucky, there is a possibility that your data could be accessible to another customer, particularly if that customer happens to be a hacker that's looking for ways to break that boundary and access your data. There is always a small risk. However, there are some good mitigating controls you can have in place. Usually, things like data encryption will help. Depends on the issue, but generally speaking, data encryption will help. and making sure that you've got your own security controls in place between the cloud environment and your own on-premises infrastructure is also worth considering too. There are a few scenarios where attackers and us will find ways into a cloud environment, and then we'll find our way from the cloud environment down onto your on-premises infrastructure in office buildings or data centers. So finding ways to make sure that you can segregate things appropriately, and where you need to have those connections, you have the right amount of logging and monitoring and alerting in place, so that if there is a strange movement of data or accounts between a cloud environment and an on-premises environment, you can spot that and you can raise an appropriately high risk alert to deal with that incident before it becomes more serious.
Thank you so very much, Sam, for that brief and quick explanation, but in detail as well. As always, it really was a pleasure to get all the insights from you, and very, very enlightening indeed. We'd look forward to having more sessions with you as well in future. I would also like to thank all the attendees who have stretched beyond the time that was allotted for this session and stayed back with us and did ask some very, very interesting and very much useful and to the point questions, which helped us to get more insight about the way we can utilize the services of NetSPI. So thank you very much, Sam, as well, and the entire team supporting this webinar presentation as well.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
So with this, we'll close this webinar, and we will also keep you informed, all the attendees, about the next webinars that we would have planned, and so that you can block your calendars for the same as well. Thank you very much once again for attending.